A war usually does not begin in a single day. One morning, borders are crossed, armies start marching, radios fill with urgent bulletins, and newspapers print enormous headlines. But before that morning arrives, there are fears that have been building for years. There are unfinished accounts. There are treaties that have been signed, but have never truly satisfied anyone. World War II began in exactly that way. When Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, the world entered a new catastrophe. But that day was only the visible beginning of the war. The real story had begun much earlier, among the ruins of the First World War. In 1918, people believed that peace had finally arrived. Europe was exhausted. Cities had been destroyed, economies had been shaken, and millions of people had died. An entire generation had been consumed on the fronts. Those who survived were left asking the same question. How could such a catastrophe ever be prevented from happening again? The answer was supposed to be the creation of a new world order. Treaties would be signed, borders would be redrawn, defeated states would be punished, and the victors would be secured. On paper, the goal was peace. But sometimes peace is only the silent waiting room of another war, because the order created in 1919 looked like justice to some, but humiliation to others. Some wanted to feel safe. Some wanted to regain what they had lost. Others hid old resentments behind new borders. And for 20 years, the world watched that resentment grow. In this video, we will explain how World War II began. We will follow, step by step, the approach of a disaster too large to be explained by a single bullet, a single leader, or a single treaty. We will trace the road from Versailles to economic collapse, from Hitler's rise to the Munich Agreement, from the Polish crisis to the declarations of war. Because the beginning of this war was not only a military attack. It was the story of a peace order falling apart. By the autumn of 1918, Germany could no longer continue the war. Its soldiers were exhausted at the fronts. At home, the population was struggling with hunger, poverty, and despair. The empire that had promised victory for so many years was finally forced to retreat. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The guns fell silent. But Europe did not truly find peace, because the end of the war did not mean the end of the problems the war had left behind. On the contrary, the greatest problems were only beginning. What would be done with the defeated? How would the victors secure themselves? How would the maps be drawn? What kind of order would be created to prevent the same catastrophe from happening again? The answer to these questions was sought in Paris in 1919. The victorious powers gathered to determine the conditions of the post-war world. There was a great claim at the center of the talks. A lasting peace would be built. But not everyone at the table wanted the same thing. France wanted a security order that would prevent another German attack. Britain wanted to keep the balance of power in Europe from being completely overturned. United States President Woodrow Wilson imagined a more idealistic order based on international cooperation. But these goals did not fully match one another. The order that emerged was especially harsh for Germany. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The treaty forced Germany to accept responsibility for the First World War. Germany would pay enormous reparations. Its army would be severely limited. It would not be allowed to have an air force. Its navy would be reduced. It would lose territory. Its colonies would be taken away. The Rhineland would be demilitarized. For the victors, this meant security. For many people in Germany, it meant national humiliation. What mattered here was not only the articles of the treaty. What mattered was how those articles were perceived inside German society. Many Germans wanted to believe that they had not been completely defeated on the battlefield. The fronts had collapsed, the empire had fallen, but accepting responsibility for defeat was extremely difficult. In this atmosphere, a dangerous myth began to grow. The idea that Germany had not been beaten at the front, but betrayed from within. This idea did not reflect historical reality. Germany had become militarily, economically, and politically unable to continue the war. But instead of facing defeat, it was easier for many people to look for enemies to blame. The newly founded Weimar Republic had to carry this burden from its very first days. The Republic had been born after defeat. The politicians who signed the Treaty of Versailles were not seen by part of the public as people who had brought peace, but as people who had accepted humiliation. This weakened the legitimacy of the democratic order from the beginning. The Weimar Republic faced an almost impossible task. It had to rebuild a country that had just come out of war. It had to deal with heavy economic burdens. It had to control political violence, and it had to regain the trust of a population whose confidence had been shattered. This was not easy. Different groups clashed in the streets. On one side were those who wanted revolution. On the other were those who dreamed of the return of the old order. In the middle stood a fragile democracy, trying to survive. The Versailles Order created unrest not only in Germany, but in other parts of Europe as well. After the war, empires had collapsed, new states had been founded, and borders had been redrawn. But these borders often failed to resolve ethnic, cultural, and political tensions. Some communities found themselves inside borders they considered wrong. Some states tried to protect their new gains. Others lived with the dream of taking back what they had lost. The League of Nations was created to preserve peace. The idea was powerful. States would solve their problems through diplomacy, not war. If one country acted aggressively, the others would respond together. In this way, war would be deterred. But the system had serious problems. First of all, the United States did not join the League of Nations. This weakened the institution from the start. In addition, the League had no real military power to enforce its decisions. When their own interests were at stake, the great powers were often reluctant to act together. On paper, the world had a new order. In reality, that order lacked the will needed to defend it. In the early 1920s, a strange silence hung over Europe. The war was over, but not everyone was at peace. Even the victorious states did not feel secure. The defeated were angry. The newly created states were fragile. Economies had been shaken. Societies were traumatized. There was peace. But the foundations of that peace were full of cracks, and those cracks would soon widen. Because for the post-war order to survive, it needed more than treaties. It needed economic stability. It needed a world in which people could find work, currencies could hold their value, and governments could inspire trust. But in 1929, the world economy plunged into a massive collapse, and that collapse would make Europe's fragile peace far more dangerous. In the mid-1920s, Europe began, at least for a short time, to breathe again. The wounds of war were still open. The Versailles Order was still controversial. Anger in Germany had not disappeared. Even so, in the streets, in newspapers, and in government buildings, a different atmosphere was slowly taking shape. Perhaps peace could be preserved. In Germany, the currency had regained stability. Industry had begun to recover. Cultural life in the cities was reviving. Despite all its weaknesses, the Weimar Republic seemed to have managed to stay on its feet. But beneath this recovery lay a very fragile foundation. The German economy depended heavily on foreign loans, especially capital, coming from the United States. This money kept factories operating, allowed companies to roll over their debts, and helped the state continue paying reparations. In other words, the system was functioning, but it was not solid. The crash that began on the New York Stock Exchange in 1929 seemed at first to be an American crisis. Share prices were falling, banks were shaking, and investors were selling in panic. But the modern world was now interconnected. An economic fire that began in one place could quickly spread to other continents. And it did. American banks began calling in the loans they had extended to Europe. The flow of new credit dried up. For economies such as Germany, which stood on debt and foreign capital, this was a severe blow. Factories reduced production. Companies closed. Banks came under pressure. Unemployment rose rapidly. Millions of people who had only recently begun to believe in recovery were thrown once again into uncertainty. For Germany, this was not only an economic crisis, it was also a disaster that awakened memory, because people had not forgotten what had happened only a few years earlier. In 1923, Germany had experienced one of the most destructive inflation crises in history. Money had become almost worthless. Wages melted away before they could be spent, and savings disappeared. People went to the market with bags full of cash and returned with only a few basic necessities. That trauma had been carved into society's mind. And after 1929, the new collapse forced people to ask the same question again. Can this order truly protect us? This was the greatest problem of the Weimar Republic. Democracy promised stability. Law, representation, elections, parliaments, all of these seemed meaningful in times of peace. But when people lost their jobs, when tables were empty, when the future went dark, patience with democratic institutions began to fade. Politics became increasingly harsh. Parliament struggled to produce compromise. Governments became short-lived. As the crisis deepened, the parties of the center lost trust, while movements on the extremes gained strength. On one side, communists claimed that the capitalist order had completely collapsed. On the other, far-right movements argued that Germany had been betrayed, that the chains of Versailles had to be broken, and that a strong leader would raise the country up again. For millions caught between these two extremes, politics was no longer a debate of ideas. It was a question of survival. For an unemployed father, democracy was an abstract concept. For a shopkeeper forced to close his shutters, Parliament was a distant building. For a family that had lost its savings, freedom did not put food on the table. The crisis changed people's priorities. More people wanted order. More people wanted a strong leader. More people wanted someone to blame. And in such periods, the most dangerous politics is the politics that offers simple answers to complex problems. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party spoke directly into this emptiness. In the early 1920s, this movement had been associated with a failed coup attempt and had long seemed marginal. But with the economic crisis, it began to reach much broader masses. Hitler did not explain Germany's problems calmly and one by one. Instead, he gave direction to anger. He targeted the Treaty of Versailles. He targeted Weimar politicians. He targeted communists. He targeted Jews. He said Germany would become great again, unemployment would end, order would be restored, the army would grow strong, and national pride would return. Many of these promises were dangerous, aggressive, and exclusionary. But in a society living through crisis, this language began to sound powerful to more and more people. Nazi propaganda was not limited to rallies. Through posters, newspapers, speeches, symbols, marches, and disciplined party organization, it spread into society. Hitler did not present himself as an ordinary politician, but as the person who would change the fate of the nation. This was especially effective in a country where the feeling of helplessness was growing. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party still had limited support. But by 1930, the picture had changed. As the economic crisis deepened, the party greatly increased its vote. By 1932, it had become one of the largest political forces in Germany. This rise cannot be explained only by Hitler's speaking ability. The real issue was that society had become ready to listen to him. The crisis had weakened the political center. Unemployment had deepened fear. Anger at Versailles was still alive. Fear of communism disturbed business circles and conservative groups. Many people, even if they saw Hitler as dangerous, believed he could be controlled. That miscalculation would later become one of the heaviest prices in European history. The economic collapse did not affect Germany alone. Britain and France also felt the pressure of the crisis. These countries, still carrying the memories of war and struggling with their own economies, did not want to enter a new conflict. Their publics were exhausted by the idea of war. Their governments were trying to solve domestic problems. This atmosphere changed foreign policy as well. It became harder to respond firmly to aggressive moves, because every firm response raised the possibility of a new war. For many leaders in Europe, the main goal was to delay a major war at almost any cost. But sometimes the concessions made to delay war only bring war closer. The Great Depression did not strike only banks and factories. It struck confidence in democracy. It struck belief in international cooperation. It struck the patience of societies, the courage of states, and the durability of the peace order. The fragile system created after the First World War cracked even further under the pressure of economic crisis. People were no longer only settling accounts with the past. They were also acting out of fear for the future. And when fear moves to the center of politics, the harshest voices become easier to hear. By the early 1930s, Europe was still at peace. But beneath that peace, unemployment, anger, ideology, and the desire for revenge were accumulating. In Germany, one movement had begun to turn that accumulation to its own advantage. Soon that movement would find a place not only in election squares, but at the center of the state itself. And with Adolf Hitler's rise to power, the crisis in Europe would enter a new phase. By 1933, Germany's crisis was no longer confined to election results. There was a deeper fracture felt in the streets, in newspapers, in factories, in universities, and in government offices. People feared the future. Political parties treated one another as enemies. Parliament could not produce a strong center capable of rebuilding the country. In this atmosphere, Adolf Hitler presented himself not only as a party leader, but as the symbol of Germany's rebirth. The story he told was simple. Germany had been wronged. The Treaty of Versailles had chained the country. The Weimar Republic was weak. Communism threatened the nation from within. National pride had to be restored. The army had to become strong again. The people had to unite around a single will. This message sounded powerful to millions living through crisis. Because Hitler did not represent anger alone, he also promised order. He promised work. He promised security. He said that lost dignity would return. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. This moment was one of the most dangerous miscalculations in history. Some of the conservative circles that helped bring Hitler to power believed they could control him. They thought they could benefit from the mass support of the Nazi Party while keeping the real management of the state in their own hands. But when Hitler came to power, his goal was not merely to take part in government. His goal was to seize the state completely. In the first months, change in Germany moved very quickly. After coming to power, the Nazis began transforming democratic institutions from within. Elections still existed. Parliament still existed. Courts, ministries, newspapers, and state governments still seemed to be functioning. But the meaning of everything was changing. In the streets, Nazi paramilitary organizations put pressure on opponents. Meetings were broken up, political rivals were threatened, journalists were silenced, and the space available to opposition movements narrowed. On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burned. The burning of the German parliament became a major opportunity for the new regime. Immediately after the fire, it was claimed that communists were trying to overthrow the state. Panic was amplified. The sense of threat was sharpened. The next day, a decree suspended basic rights and freedoms. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, privacy, and personal security were severely restricted. The state could now arrest opponents much more easily, ban publications, and crush political organizations. Crises had been used to break through the rule of law. The elections held in March 1933 took place under the shadow of this atmosphere of pressure. The Nazi Party increased its vote, but Hitler's goal was not simply electoral success. What he needed was legal power that would make Parliament ineffective. On March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act was passed. This law gave the government the authority to make laws without parliamentary approval. In this way, the legislative power at the heart of German democracy effectively passed into the hands of the government. A republic was being dismantled through its own institutions. After this, the process accelerated even further. State governments were brought under central control, trade unions were shut down, political parties were pressured, opponents were arrested. The press was controlled. Culture, education, and bureaucracy were all pushed into alignment with Nazi ideology. In July 1933, the Nazi Party became the only legal political party in Germany. Power in Germany was no longer a competition decided at the ballot box. All institutions of the state were being pulled toward a single party and a single leader. This transformation was not limited to politics. The whole of society was to be reshaped. In schools, young people were taught the regime's worldview. Youth organizations grew. Radios and newspapers repeated the same messages. Huge rallies, flags, marches, and symbols constantly gave people the same feeling. Germany was rising again. But peace was not at the center of this idea of rebirth. At the foundation of Nazi ideology lay struggle. It contained a racist worldview, aggressive nationalism, anti-Semitism, fear of communism, and the dream of expansion toward the East. For Hitler, Germany had to destroy the Versailles Order, rebuild its military power, and create a new balance of power in Europe. For that reason, Germany's internal transformation after 1933 cannot be separated from its foreign policy. While dictatorship was being built at home, the conditions for war were being prepared abroad. In October 1933, Germany withdrew from the Disarmament Conference and from the League of Nations. This step showed clearly how the Nazi regime viewed the international order. Germany no longer wanted to see itself as bound by the rules of the Versailles system. Hitler presented this to the German people as an act of defiance. The country would not accept humiliation. It would not remain within borders drawn by others. It would determine its own fate. These words were effective for many Germans who had lived with the feeling of post-war humiliation. But for the rest of Europe, they were a dangerous signal. Germany began to rearm. At first, this process was partly carried out in secret. The restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles were still in force. Germany's army was supposed to remain small, its heavy weapons capacity limited, and it was not supposed to have an air force. But the Nazi regime worked systematically to overcome these limits. Factories were directed toward military production. Young men were prepared for future war. The state economy became increasingly tied to the goals of rearmament. The fight against unemployment was carried out together with large public projects and military preparation. This gave Hitler a major propaganda advantage at home. People were finding work. The rebuilding of the army fed national pride. The sense that the chains of Versailles were being broken spread widely. The Nazi regime presented economic recovery as its own success and used it to increase public support. But this recovery had a price. Germany was becoming an increasingly aggressive state. Its economy was being organized less around the needs of peace and more around the needs of a future war. State resources flowed into weapons and military power. In the summer of 1934, Hitler took a harsher step against forces that might threaten his power. Even within the Nazi movement, there were different centers of power. The SA in particular had grown through street violence, but it had become disturbing to the army and conservative circles. To win the support of the army and eliminate rivals inside the party, Hitler launched a bloody purge. This event went down in history as the Night of the Long Knives. The SA leadership and many others seen as threats to the regime were killed or removed. This showed that Hitler's power was being consolidated, not only through propaganda and elections, but also through direct violence. Soon afterward, the last symbolic element of balance in Germany disappeared. President Paul von Hindenburg died in August 1934. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President in his own person. The army swore loyalty not to the state or the Constitution, but directly to Hitler. From this moment on, the center of power in Germany was completely Hitler. State, party, and leader were fused together. This transformation changed the direction of the crisis in Europe. Germany was no longer led by an ordinary government that wanted to soften the Versailles Order through diplomatic bargaining. It was led by an ideological, militarist, and aggressive regime that wanted to reshape the map of Europe. Hitler's goals did not appear only gradually. Many of them had already been visible in his writings, speeches, and political program. German rearmament, the destruction of Versailles, the unification of regions inhabited by Germans, and expansion toward the east all stood at the center of Nazi thought. Despite this, many leaders in Europe preferred for a long time to see the danger as a limited demand for revision. In their view, some German complaints could be understood. Versailles had been very harsh. Keeping the German army completely weak might not be sustainable. For the sake of economic and political stability, Germany might have to be given some room. These ideas would later form the ground for the policy of appeasement. But what happened in Germany between 1933 and 1935 was no longer simply a matter of correcting the post-war order. A dictatorship had been established. This dictatorship was reshaping society, crushing opposition, expanding the army, and preparing foreign policy according to the idea of using force. In 1935, Germany reintroduced conscription. Around the same time, the existence of an air force was openly announced. This was a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Europe saw it, but it could not produce a strong and united response. Britain and France still wanted to avoid war. They were dealing with their own internal problems. Their publics had no desire for a new war. In addition, some circles thought Germany might serve as a counterweight against the Soviet Union. These calculations gave Hitler time. And for Hitler, time meant rearmament. With every passing year, Germany became a little stronger. The Nazi regime became a little more secure at home, and Europe's indecision became a little more visible. By the mid-1930s, the stage had changed. The anger created by Versailles, the wounds opened by economic crisis, and the collapse of Weimar democracy had given way to a far more dangerous period. Germany was moving beyond being a country that claimed to be the victim of the peace order. Germany was becoming a power preparing to destroy that order, and the first major test would soon take place in the Rhineland. As Hitler consolidated his power in Germany, the rest of Europe watched. But this watching looked less like determined resistance and more like anxious waiting. Britain and France could see the change taking place in Germany. They knew that the Versailles Order was being openly targeted. The language of the Nazi regime went far beyond an ordinary diplomatic objection. Germany did not merely want certain treaty clauses revised. It wanted to create a new balance of power in Europe. But stopping this was not easy, because the world of the 1930s was not the world of 1914. The memory of the First World War was still very fresh. The shadow of millions who had died at the fronts hung over European societies. A generation knew what war meant not only from books, but from its own families. For this reason, the idea of a new war created deep fear, especially in British and French public opinion. Politicians were aware of this fear. When a leader wanted to follow a firm foreign policy, he had to convince not only other states, but his own people as well. In the early 1930s, many people were living with the feeling of never again. There would never again be a great war. There would never again be millions of young men dying at the fronts. There would never again be cities, factories, and families dragged into the same catastrophe. This feeling was understandable. But history can sometimes turn even the most human fears into dangerous consequences. Because constantly retreating in the face of an aggressive regime only gives that regime courage. One reason for Europe's inaction was fear of war. Another was economic crisis. The Great Depression had shaken not only Germany, Britain, France, and many other parts of the world were also struggling with economic hardship. Unemployment, declining production, budget problems, and social unrest changed the priorities of governments. States did not want to take great risks abroad while trying to remain standing at home. Standing up to an aggressor was not simply a matter of issuing a diplomatic statement. It required military preparation, economic sacrifice, public support, and long-term determination. In the early 1930s, that determination did not exist. Moreover, Europe had an institution that was expected to preserve peace, the League of Nations. This institution had been created after the First World War. The basic idea was this: if one state acted aggressively, other states would respond together, and aggression would be deterred. On paper, this idea was strong. In reality, the system was very weak. The League of Nations had no army of its own. To enforce its decisions, it needed the united will of the great powers. But great powers often failed to act together when their own interests were at risk. The absence of the United States was also a major weakness. When one of the rising economic and political powers of the world remained outside the system, the League was born weak from the beginning. This weakness was soon tested. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. The League of Nations investigated the situation, prepared reports, and issued condemnations. But no effective force emerged to reverse the aggression. Japan left the League of Nations in 1933. This sent a very dangerous message to the world. A state could violate the international order and continue on its path without paying a heavy price. A few years later, a similar test took place in Africa. In 1935, Italy attacked Ethiopia. This was open aggression. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but these sanctions remained limited. No steps harsh enough to truly stop Italy were taken. There was no oil embargo. The Suez Canal was not closed. Britain and France did not want to turn Italy completely against them. Because Germany's rise in Europe was already worrying them, they wanted to keep Italy away from Germany. For this reason, no determined common front was created during the Ethiopian crisis. The result was the same again. Aggression was not rewarded openly, but it was not punished strongly enough either. Hitler watched these developments carefully. The world was talking but struggling to act. It condemned but did not stop. It worried but did not want to take risks. In this atmosphere, Germany's steps became bolder. In 1935, Hitler reintroduced conscription. He openly announced that Germany had an air force. This was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Britain, France, and other states saw this violation. But no united and severe sanction was imposed on Germany. That same year, Britain and Germany signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. This agreement allowed Germany to expand its navy up to a certain ratio. And from Britain's point of view, this was a way to keep German naval power limited and controllable. But from a wider perspective, it became a sign that weakened the Versailles Order. As Germany moved beyond the treaty restrictions, it could also make separate arrangements with some great powers. This eroded the idea of a common front from the start. For France, the situation was more complicated. France was one of the countries most afraid of Germany becoming strong again. In 1914, German armies had entered France. The destruction of the First World War had been experienced heavily on French soil. France's security concerns were therefore real, but France did not want to act alone. Taking a hard step against Germany without British support seemed risky. Domestic politics were divided. The economy was under strain. It was clear that the public was not ready for a new war. For this reason, France often worried, but waited. Britain looked at Germany differently. Some British politicians believed that the Treaty of Versailles had indeed been too harsh. They thought some German demands might be reasonable. They hoped that if limited concessions were made to Germany, stability in Europe could be preserved. Britain also had the responsibilities of a global empire. Every crisis in Europe had to be considered alongside interests in other parts of the world. Japan in the Far East, Italy in the Mediterranean, Germany in Europe, the Soviet Union in the East. Threats were not concentrated in one place. This complex picture made decision-making even harder. But in Hitler's world, this indecision was read as weakness. For the Nazi regime, diplomacy often became a tool for measuring the limits of the other side. A step would be taken, the reaction would be observed, and if the reaction was weak, the next step would be prepared. This was a dangerous rhythm, because every successful violation made the next one more possible. In the mid-1930s, Europe faced two choices. Either an early and firm line would be drawn against violations of the Versailles Order, or aggressive moves would be postponed until they turned into a larger crisis. Europe drifted toward the second path. During this process, the idea of appeasement gained strength. According to this thinking, if some of Germany's demands were accepted, a larger war could be prevented. Hitler's demands might be limited, the anger created by Versailles might be reduced, and Germany might be drawn back into the international order. Under the conditions of the time, this idea was not entirely meaningless. The fear of war was real. Some believed that certain aspects of Versailles could not be sustained. Economic crisis had weakened states. No one wanted to send millions of people into a new war. But the problem was this: Hitler's goals were not limited. The Nazi regime did not merely want to secure a few diplomatic gains for Germany. It aimed to change the political map of Europe by force. Racist and expansionist ideology stood at the center of foreign policy. This reality was not accepted early enough. Each German move was treated as a separate crisis. In truth, these moves were links in a much larger chain. First, withdrawal from the League of Nations, then rearmament, then conscription, then the announcement of an air force. Each step meant that the post-war order was being worn away a little more, and the world could not produce the united will needed to stop this erosion. This was not only a diplomatic failure, it was also a psychological failure. One of Hitler's greatest advantages was that his opponents could not act as quickly or as decisively as he did. In democratic states, making decisions took time. Public opinion had to be convinced. Parliaments debated. The press criticized. Elections approached. A dictatorship moved faster. This difference in speed became decisive in the crises of the 1930s. Germany took risks. The others hesitated. Germany tested boundaries. The others held meetings. Germany violated treaties. The others debated how dangerous it was. And every debate gave Hitler a little more time. By 1936, Germany was ready to take a larger step. The target was the Rhineland. Under the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties, this area had been demilitarized. On Germany's western border, it was intended as a security buffer against France. If Germany sent troops into the region, this would not be just another treaty violation. It would be an open challenge to Europe's will. Hitler knew the risk. The German army was not yet ready for a major war with France. If France had responded firmly, German units could have faced a serious crisis. The Rhineland move was therefore also a gamble. But Hitler had now seen how the world opposite him behaved. There had been a weak response in Manchuria. There had been a weak response in Ethiopia. There had been no strong answer to rearmament. The announcement of conscription had not been stopped. The League of Nations condemned, but did not deter. Britain and France worried, but could not act together. This picture gave Hitler courage. On March 7, 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland. This moment would become one of the most critical turning points on the road to World War II. Because it was not only soldiers who were marching. One of the last security walls of the Versailles order was collapsing as well. On the morning of March 7, 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland. This region was German territory. But under the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties, it had been demilitarized. Germany was not supposed to station troops there, build fortifications there, or turn this area near the French border into a military zone. The purpose of this arrangement was clear. France wanted a guarantee against a new German attack. The Rhineland was imagined as a buffer between Germany and France. If Germany became aggressive again, France would have early warning and a defensive advantage. For that reason, the remilitarization of the Rhineland was not a simple border movement. It was a direct challenge to the post-war order in Europe. Hitler knew that he was taking a major risk. The German army was still in the process of rebuilding. On paper, France's military strength was superior to Germany's. If France had responded immediately, German troops might have been forced to retreat. In fact, German units had been ordered to withdraw without fighting if there was a strong French intervention. So on March 7, 1936, Europe stood for a brief moment at a threshold that could have changed the direction of the coming war. But France did not want to act alone. There was political uncertainty at home. Elections were approaching. The public feared a new war. Without open British support, the government saw a military step against Germany as dangerous. Britain did not view the Rhineland issue as harshly as France did. In some British circles, the dominant thought was this: Germany had sent troops into its own territory. This was certainly a treaty violation, but for the British public it was not easy to turn it into a reason for war. Hitler's move was condemned. Diplomatic protests were made. The League of Nations took up the issue. But German soldiers were not removed from the Rhineland. And for Hitler, this was a major victory. Because the victory was not only military, its real meaning was psychological. Inside Germany, Hitler presented himself as the leader who had broken the chains of Versailles. He showed the German people that the order long seen as humiliation was now being pushed back. In the streets and newspapers, regime propaganda gave the same message. Germany was rising again. This event also changed the balance of power in Europe. Once the Rhineland was remilitarized, France's security buffer disappeared. Germany could now move more freely on its western border. This would later give Hitler more room to act when he turned east. The Rhineland move was a turning point, because Hitler saw this: risks could be taken. Treaties could be violated. If the other side was not determined, a crisis could be turned into a gain. After this, Nazi foreign policy became bolder. At the same time, balances were shifting elsewhere in Europe. Italy's attack on Ethiopia had exposed the weakness of the League of Nations. As Italy moved away from Britain and France, it began to move closer to Germany. In 1936, the closeness between Germany and Italy became more visible. This relationship would later be known as the Rome-Berlin axis. That same year, civil war broke out in Spain. This war was like Europe's ideological tension compressed onto a smaller stage. On one side were Republican forces, on the other, nationalist forces. Germany and Italy supported Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union helped the Republican side. The Spanish Civil War became one of the warnings of the larger war to come. Germany did not merely choose a political side there. It also gained military experience. Aircraft, tactics, bombing methods, and some tools of modern warfare were tested. Europe witnessed a small rehearsal for the destruction it would later see. But the great powers again avoided direct intervention. They feared that the war might spread across Europe. This fear widened the room for aggressive regimes to move. After 1936, Hitler had new targets in front of him. One of them was Austria. The idea of uniting Germany and Austria was not new. After the First World War, the union of the two countries had been forbidden by treaties. Such a union could make Germany stronger and upset the balance in Central Europe. For Hitler, however, Austria's separate existence was unacceptable. He himself had been born in Austria. Nazi ideology argued that regions inhabited by Germans should be united under a single state. This idea was presented as national unity, but in reality it became one of the first steps of aggressive expansion. There were also pro-Nazi groups inside Austria. With German support, these groups pressured the government. Those who wanted to preserve Austrian independence found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. In 1934, pro-Nazi forces in Austria had attempted a coup, and Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss had been killed. At that time, Italy supported Austria's independence. Mussolini did not want Germany expanding southward. But by 1938, the picture had changed. Italy was now much closer to Germany. The Ethiopian crisis and diplomatic isolation in Europe had pushed Mussolini toward Hitler. Austria could no longer find the same level of external support. Hitler saw this. Pressure on Austria increased. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg tried to organize a referendum to preserve his country's independence. His goal was to show that the Austrian people did not want to join Germany. Hitler did not accept this. Germany put pressure on the Austrian government. It demanded that pro-Nazi Arthur Seyss-Inquart be given an important position in the government. Then the crisis escalated rapidly. On March 12, 1938, German troops entered Austria. They met no serious military resistance. The next day, the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany, was announced. Hitler wanted to show that he had entered Austria not as an occupier, but as a savior welcomed by enthusiastic crowds. Propaganda images were used for this purpose. Crowds in the squares, flags, and speeches created the impression that the Union had taken place through the will of the people. But behind these images were pressure, threats, and political coercion. Austria's independence had disappeared. Europe watched this too. Britain and France protested, but again gave no military or powerful diplomatic response. The Austrian question was seen by many as a matter among Germans. In other words, Hitler's expansionism was once again perceived as a limited demand. But the Anschluss was an enormous step. Germany had expanded its territory without fighting a major war. It had increased its population, expanded its economic resources, and strengthened its strategic position. And it had done this in full view of Europe. This success increased Hitler's confidence even more, because by now the method was clear. First, the rights of German communities in the target country would be brought onto the agenda. Then, pro-Nazi movements inside that country would be supported. Then, diplomatic pressure would be applied. At the final stage, military threat would enter the picture. This model would soon be applied to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was one of the new states created after 1918. It held a strategic position in Central Europe. Its industry was strong. Its army was a serious force. It also had important defensive lines along its borders, but there were ethnic tensions inside the country. In particular, large numbers of Germans lived in the Sudetenland. Hitler began to use this situation for his foreign policy. He claimed that the rights of the Sudeten Germans were being violated and accused Czechoslovakia of oppressing Germans. These claims became a new tool of Nazi propaganda. Berlin expanded the crisis through the Sudeten German Party. Demands kept increasing. Calls for autonomy combined with political pressure and street tension. The Czechoslovak government was trying to maintain order at home while facing German pressure abroad. This crisis was far more dangerous than Austria, because Czechoslovakia had an alliance with France. The Soviet Union had also promised, under certain conditions, to help Czechoslovakia. If Germany attacked, the crisis could bring great powers into confrontation. But Hitler was ready to take risks again. In his eyes, Czechoslovakia was not simply a diplomatic problem. It was one of the major obstacles to Germany's rise in Central Europe. Czechoslovakia's defensive lines, industrial capacity, and geographic position were important for Nazi plans. If the Sudetenland were taken, Czechoslovakia's defenses would be greatly weakened. For that reason, even though Hitler tried to present the crisis as a question of minority rights, the real target was larger. The map of Europe was being changed step by step. In the Rhineland, treaties had been tested. In Austria, an independent state had been eliminated. Now it was Czechoslovakia's turn. For Britain and France, this was now a more serious crisis. Hitler's demands were growing, Germany was becoming stronger, and the balance in Europe was rapidly breaking down. Even so, fear of war still hung over decisions like a heavy shadow. The central question in London and Paris was this: should they go to war for Czechoslovakia? This was not only a military question, it was also a moral, political, and psychological question. Would the independence of a state be protected? Would treaties still have meaning? Would Hitler's demands stop here? Or would every concession carry him to the next target? By the summer of 1938, Europe still had not found the answer. Hitler was increasing the pressure. Czechoslovakia was trying to resist. Britain and France were searching for a new diplomatic path to prevent war. And the world would once again see whether a concession made in the name of peace could truly preserve peace. This road would lead Europe to Munich. In the summer of 1938, Europe once again came to the edge of war. This time, the crisis centered on Czechoslovakia. Hitler was pressuring Czechoslovakia by using the German population of the Sudetenland as his justification. Nazi propaganda claimed that the Sudeten Germans were being oppressed, that their rights were being violated, and that Germany had a duty to protect them. But behind the issue lay a much larger goal. Czechoslovakia was a strong obstacle standing in Germany's path in Central Europe. Its industry was developed. Its army was a force to be taken seriously. Its border regions contained defensive lines. If the Sudetenland were taken, Czechoslovakia would not only lose territory, it would lose the heart of its defensive strength. Hitler knew this. The Czechoslovak government knew this. Britain and France knew this. But knowing did not mean acting. Czechoslovakia had an alliance with France. The Soviet Union also said it was ready to help under certain conditions. On paper, this meant a serious risk for Germany. If the crisis turned into war, Germany could be strained on more than one front. But Hitler's calculation was different. He had seen that Britain and France did not want war. They had not forced him back in the Rhineland. They had not given a hard answer to the annexation of Austria. The League of Nations was already far from being a deterrent. So Hitler increased the pressure. Inside Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten German Party hardened its demands. With support from Berlin, the crisis was constantly intensified. As demands were met, new demands appeared. Tension did not decrease, but grew. This was the familiar method of Nazi diplomacy. First, a story of victimhood was created. Then the crisis was deepened. Then the threat of war was placed on the table. Finally, the other side was expected to retreat. In September 1938, the atmosphere in Europe became heavy. Newspapers wrote about the possibility of war, governments held emergency meetings, and publics followed the news with fear. The memory of the First World War was still alive. No one knew where a new great war might end. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to meet Hitler directly in order to prevent war. Chamberlain's goal was to solve the crisis through diplomacy. In his view, if Germany's demands, which appeared limited and reasonable, were accepted, Europe could be saved from a larger war. This idea had broad support in Britain at the time, because the fear of war was very real. Britain was not yet fully ready for a major European war. Fear of air raids weighed heavily on the public mind. Many believed that the next war would be fought not only at the fronts, but over cities as well. It was said that bombers could strike capitals and that civilians could become direct targets. France was also in a difficult position. It had an alliance with Czechoslovakia, but it did not want to act alone against Germany without British support. Domestic politics were divided. Society was not ready for the idea of war. France's defense strategy also relied heavily on waiting and fortified lines. Under these conditions, diplomacy looked to many leaders like the last hope. But for Czechoslovakia, the situation was very different. While decisions were being made about its territory, the country was becoming an item on the table of the great powers. Czechoslovakia wanted to resist. It could mobilize its army, use its defensive lines, and impose a serious cost on Germany. But the possibility of being left alone was very high. This was one of the bitterest realities for small and medium-sized states in a world of great powers. On paper, treaties existed. But in a moment of crisis, the real question was whether there was actual will behind those treaties. On September 29, 1938, a conference met in Munich. At the table were Germany, Italy, Britain, and France. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Neville Chamberlain, and Édouard Daladier gathered to sign decisions that would shape the fate of Europe. But one of the most important parties was not at the table. Czechoslovakia had not been invited. While decisions were made about its own territory, Czechoslovak representatives were left outside the conference table. The Soviet Union was not present either. This revealed the character of the agreement from the very beginning. This was not a calm compromise between equal parties. It was the transfer of one state's territory to another state in order to prevent war. Under the Munich Agreement, the Sudetenland would be given to Germany. Czechoslovakia would lose much of its border defenses, industrial regions, and strategic advantage. Britain and France hoped that this concession would preserve peace in Europe. When Chamberlain returned home, there was a great atmosphere of relief. Many people believed war had been prevented. Crowds welcomed him in London. Newspapers spoke of peace. Europe seemed, at least for that moment, to have stepped back from the edge of the abyss. But this relief was misleading, because Munich did not remove the possibility of war. It only postponed it. And this postponement made Germany stronger, not weaker. Czechoslovakia's defensive lines were broken apart. Germany seized strategic regions without a war. The balance of power in Central Europe shifted in favor of Nazi Germany. Hitler appeared to have won a major victory at home. He was no longer only the leader who had broken Versailles. He was the leader who had forced Europe's great powers to retreat at the table. This increased the confidence of the Nazi regime even further. One of the greatest problems of the Munich Agreement was that it misread Hitler's goals. Britain and France hoped that his demands might remain limited to the Sudetenland. If the regions where German-speaking populations lived were given to Germany, they believed the crisis might end. But for Hitler, the Sudetenland was not the final goal. It was only a step. Nazi foreign policy would not be satisfied with border corrections. It wanted to expand German dominance in Europe, spread eastward, and build a new order through force. Munich did not stop this. It opened the way. For Czechoslovakia, the result of the agreement was severe. The country lost its natural defensive lines. The strategic advantage of its army was largely destroyed. Some of its economic resources passed into German hands. Morale collapsed at home. Trust in its allies was destroyed abroad. A state had been weakened without a war. This affected not only Czechoslovakia, but all of Europe. Small states began to ask the same question. How valuable were the guarantees of the great powers in a moment of crisis? If the territory of one state could become a bargaining chip for the very allies that were supposed to defend it, what meaning did the international order still have? This question created deep anxiety, especially in Eastern Europe. Because as Germany's demands grew, it became less clear who the next target would be. After Munich, there was a short silence. But this silence did not mean that peace had become stronger. It looked more like the strange stillness before a storm. Hitler did not stop with the Sudetenland. In March 1939, Germany increased pressure on the remaining parts of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia was forced to separate. Then German troops entered Prague. Bohemia and Moravia were brought under German control. This development was extremely important, because Hitler could no longer claim that he wanted only the regions where German-speaking people lived. The occupation of Prague destroyed all the justifications built at Munich. This was no longer a move that could be explained by the claim of national unity. This was open expansion. For Britain and France, this moment was a major awakening. It had become much clearer that Hitler's demands were not limited. The policy of preserving peace through concessions had suffered a heavy blow. But this awakening came late. Germany was no longer the Germany of 1936. It was stronger. It was better armed. It had tested Europe's indecision again and again. After the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia crises, Hitler knew how deeply the states opposite him feared war. But the occupation of Prague changed the attitude of Britain and France. In the next crisis, retreating in the same way would be much harder, because the issue was no longer Germany's old grievances. The issue was the existence of independent states in Europe. In the spring of 1939, attention turned to a new target, Poland. Germany began to raise the issues of Danzig and the Polish corridor. These questions had been controversial since the Versailles Order. But now Europe could see that every demand Hitler made might be part of a larger plan. Britain and France gave a guarantee to Poland. This guarantee opened a new phase in the European crisis. For Hitler, backing down could damage the image of strength he had built at home. For Britain and France, retreating after Munich would destroy all of their credibility. Diplomacy, therefore, became harsher, the risks became greater, and time became shorter. The Munich Agreement had been seen by the leaders of the time as one last attempt at peace. But in history, it is remembered more as a missed warning. Because in Munich, peace was bought. Czechoslovakia paid the first price. Then all of Europe did. By 1939, the question had changed. Would Hitler stop? Would Britain and France truly resist this time? What path would the Soviet Union choose? And the Polish crisis would become the final threshold, carrying Europe from diplomatic bargaining into direct war. In the spring of 1939, Europe was no longer the same Europe. The Rhineland had been remilitarized. Austria had been incorporated into Germany. Czechoslovakia had been broken apart. German troops entering Prague had clearly shown that Hitler's aims were not limited. The hope built at Munich had collapsed. The issue was no longer only a few clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. The issue was now which state in Europe would become the next target. That target soon became clear: Poland. Poland had regained its independence after the First World War. It was one of the most important states on the new map of Europe, but its geographic position placed it in an extremely dangerous location. To its west was Germany. To its east was the Soviet Union. And Poland, caught between two great powers, moved to the center of the European crisis at the end of the 1930s. Two issues stood at the center of Germany's demands toward Poland: Danzig and the Polish corridor. After the First World War, Danzig had been separated from Germany and given the status of a free city under the supervision of the League of Nations. Most of its population spoke German. Poland, however, had important rights there because the city gave it access to the sea and to foreign trade. The Polish corridor gave Poland an outlet to the Baltic Sea, but this corridor also separated Germany's main territory from East Prussia. Hitler began to use this situation for propaganda. He said Germany had been divided. He argued that Danzig had to return to Germany. He demanded a special road and railway across the corridor to connect Germany with East Prussia. At first glance, these demands might have seemed like a subject for diplomatic bargaining. But by 1939, no one could read these demands on their own, because Europe had seen Hitler's method. First, a limited demand was made. Then the crisis was expanded. Then the threat of war was placed on the table, and the other side was forced to retreat. Poland had watched what happened to Czechoslovakia, and it did not want to suffer the same fate. For the government in Warsaw, Danzig and the corridor were not only questions of territory or transport. They were questions of Polish independence. If Poland bowed to German pressure, many believed this would not be the last demand. This belief was not wrong. Hitler's goal was not only Danzig. Poland stood as a major obstacle in the path of Germany's eastern plans. In Nazi ideology, expansion toward the east occupied a central place. The existence of Poland was the first Great Wall in front of that expansion. As the crisis deepened, diplomacy became increasingly dark. After the occupation of Prague in March 1939, the attitude of Britain and France changed. It was now clear that the concessions made after Munich had not stopped Hitler. If they retreated again, the entire balance in Europe could collapse. On March 31st, 1939, Britain gave a guarantee to Poland's independence. France maintained its commitments to Poland as well. This guarantee was a clear message to Hitler. An attack on Poland would not remain a local crisis, but Hitler did not read this message in the expected way. He still believed that Britain and France would avoid war. They had retreated at Munich. They had retreated in the Rhineland. They had given no direct response in Austria and Czechoslovakia. In Hitler's view, bargaining could again take place at the last moment. Another concession could be extracted, and the other side's fear of war could again be used. This was a fatal miscalculation. But Hitler was not the only one miscalculating. All the great powers in Europe were trying to understand one another's intentions and determination, and often arriving at the wrong conclusions. Britain and France hoped that guaranteeing Poland would deter Hitler. But it was difficult to support that guarantee with a real military strategy. If Germany attacked, it would be geographically very hard for the Western powers to send direct and rapid help to Poland. Poland feared being left alone between two great enemies. The Soviet Union was calculating its own security and interests. In the summer of 1939, European diplomacy became increasingly complicated. Britain and France discussed the possibility of reaching an agreement with the Soviet Union against Germany. Such an agreement might deter Hitler with the fear of a two-front war. But the talks moved slowly. The sides did not trust one another. Poland did not want to allow Soviet troops to pass through its territory. It feared that Soviet assistance might one day turn into Soviet domination. Given Poland's historical experience, this fear was understandable. But diplomatically, it created a major deadlock. Britain and France wanted to appear determined, but they could not move quickly. The Soviet Union wanted guarantees, but it did not trust the West. Poland feared Germany, but it did not want Soviet soldiers entering the country either. Meanwhile, Germany was not waiting. In April 1939, Hitler declared that the non-aggression pact signed with Poland in 1934 was no longer valid. Around the same time, he announced that he no longer recognized the naval agreement with Britain. These steps showed that the crisis would not remain limited to diplomatic notes. The German army was working on plans for an attack on Poland. The plan was called Fall Weiss, the White Plan. Germany intended to defeat Poland with a rapid and overwhelming attack. But Hitler still faced one major problem: the Soviet Union. If Germany attacked Poland, and the Soviet Union made an agreement with the West, Germany could face the risk of a two-front war. This had been one of Germany's greatest strategic nightmares in the First World War. Hitler wanted to remove this risk, and the most surprising diplomatic move of the summer of 1939 came here. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were two regimes ideologically hostile to one another. One saw communism as a threat to be destroyed, the other defined fascism as a deadly enemy. But states sometimes choose time and interest over ideology. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. This agreement shocked the world because Hitler and Stalin, at least on the surface, had agreed not to attack one another. For Germany, this meant temporarily removing the Soviet threat from the East while attacking Poland. For the Soviet Union, the agreement offered a chance to gain time. Stalin, who did not trust the Western powers, believed that by reaching an agreement with Germany, he could keep war away from Soviet borders for a while and gain a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The darkest part of the agreement lay in the secret protocols. Through these secret arrangements, Eastern Europe was divided into spheres of influence between Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland's future became a matter to be shared between two great powers. Poland did not know. European public opinion did not know. But one of the final locks on the road to war had been opened. Hitler now knew that if he attacked Poland, the Soviet Union would not immediately stand against him. This gave him a major strategic comfort. The guarantee given by Britain and France was still there. But Hitler believed that even if they declared war, they would not be able to respond quickly or effectively. He believed Poland would be defeated in a short time, and that the West would eventually accept the situation. This was once again a dangerous expectation, built on miscalculation. In the final days of August 1939, Europe held its breath. Diplomatic messages went back and forth. Embassies were in motion. Armies were preparing. Newspapers appeared every day with a new crisis headline. But the possibility of war was no longer a rumor. Germany had gathered its forces along the border. Poland was under the pressure of mobilization. Britain and France were giving final warnings. The Soviet Union was waiting in the silent advantage provided by its agreement. At the same time, the Nazi regime prepared propaganda to justify the attack. Germany wanted to present Poland as the aggressor. Border incidents, claims, and false pretexts would be used to cover the coming invasion. But the truth was clear. Germany had prepared for war. The crisis over Poland was no longer a diplomatic dispute waiting to be resolved. For Hitler, Poland was not a small concession to be won at the bargaining table, but a target to be crushed by military force, and the rest of Europe had acted too late to stop it. At the end of August, for a brief moment, it still seemed as if diplomacy existed. But this was no longer a true search for peace. It was more like the last echo before the approaching storm. Because the decision had been made, the German army was preparing to attack. Across the border was Poland. Behind Poland stood the guarantee of Britain and France. To the east lay the secret calculations between Germany and the Soviet Union. As the summer of 1939 ended, Europe was no longer standing at the edge of the abyss. It was already inside it. Only the first morning remained. The morning of September 1st, 1939 would be that first morning. In the final nights of August 1939, Europe was no longer sleeping. Diplomats were still sending messages, ambassadors were still holding meetings, and newspapers were still printing breaking news. But beneath all this activity lay a much heavier truth. The decision for war had already been made. Germany had concentrated its forces along the Polish border. The Air Force was ready. Armored units had been prepared. The propaganda machine was working. The Nazi regime wanted to show the world that the aggressor was not Germany, but Poland. For this, false pretexts were created. On the night of August 31st, 1939, a staged attack was carried out at the Gleiwitz radio station near the German border. The incident had been planned to create the impression that Poland had attacked Germany. Nazi propaganda would use it as a pretext for the approaching invasion. The truth was much simpler. Germany wanted to attack, and it needed a story to make that attack look legitimate. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, German forces attacked Poland. Borders were crossed, bombers took off, artillery fire began, armored units advanced. Westerplatte, near Danzig, became one of the first symbolic points of the war. The attack that began with the fire of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein soon became part of a much wider invasion. At the same time, different regions of Poland were also targeted. Germany was not advancing from a single point. The attack had been designed to break Poland apart quickly. German forces coming from the north, west, and south aimed to disrupt Poland's defenses. This new way of war was built on speed. Tanks, motorized units, aircraft, and artillery would be used together. The goal was not only to break through the enemy's front line, but to disrupt command, cut communications, and collapse resistance before it could fully organize. This approach, later known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, was seen in Poland with full force. The Polish army resisted bravely, but it was in an extremely difficult position. Poland was a country that was hard to defend geographically. Germany could attack from more than one direction. Poland's industrial and transport capacity was far more limited than Germany's. Air superiority quickly passed into German hands. Poland also had another problem: strategic expectation. The government in Warsaw trusted the guarantee given by Britain and France. If Germany attacked, it was believed that the Western Allies would put pressure on Germany and open a serious front in the West. This expectation was not entirely groundless. Britain and France had truly guaranteed Poland. But when the war began, the realities of geography and preparation made themselves clear. Britain and France could not quickly deliver direct military help to Poland. While the war between Germany and Poland advanced with full speed on Polish territory, decisions in Western Europe moved more slowly. When the attack began on September 1st, Britain and France did not immediately declare war. First, they called on Germany to withdraw. Ultimatums were issued. Diplomatic channels remained open. But Hitler did not step back. In his view, Britain and France would again avoid war at the last moment. This had happened before. It had happened in the Rhineland. It had happened in Austria. It had happened in Czechoslovakia. But this time, the situation had changed. After Munich, it had become clear that concessions had not stopped Hitler. If the guarantee given to Poland were withdrawn, all credibility Britain and France had in Europe would collapse. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. That same day, France also declared war on Germany. In this way, the attack on Poland ceased to be a local invasion. The European war had begun. Even so, these declarations of war did not mean immediate salvation for Poland. No major attack began on the Western Front. Britain had not yet sent large forces to the continent. France moved only in a limited way and remained largely defensive. Poland was effectively forced to absorb the first blow alone. The German advance was fast. Cities were bombed, roads were cut, units were encircled, and civilians tried to flee eastward in great chaos. War was no longer only a struggle between soldiers facing each other at the front. Air attacks pulled civilians directly into the war. This was one of the dark faces of 20th century warfare. The line between the front and the city was becoming increasingly blurred. The Polish army offered strong resistance in some regions. Westerplatte held out for days. Warsaw prepared to defend itself. In the Battle of Bzura, Polish units attempted a counterattack, but the overall picture did not change. Germany was breaking Polish defenses through speed and intensity, and the greatest disaster for Poland had not yet arrived. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union entered Poland from the east. This was the result of the secret terms of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact signed in August. Poland was now trapped between two great powers, Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east. After this point, it became almost impossible for Poland to maintain organized resistance. As the Polish state was broken apart, Europe faced the new reality of war. Hitler had aimed for a short and rapid victory. In that sense, the Polish campaign appeared to be a military success for Germany. But strategically, it had opened a much larger door, because Britain and France had entered the war. Germany was no longer fighting only Poland. It was at war with the great powers of Europe. One of Hitler's calculations had been correct. Poland had been crushed quickly, but another calculation had been wrong. Britain and France had declared war this time. This was one of the first great contradictions of World War II. Germany was advancing rapidly in military terms, but diplomatically it had pulled itself into a much larger war. Throughout September, Polish resistance began to collapse. Warsaw remained under heavy bombardment. Civilian casualties increased. The government was forced to leave the country. Polish territory was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. But Poland's defeat was not the end of the war. It was the beginning. Because by the autumn of 1939, Europe had reached a point of no return. For a while, there were no major battles on the Western Front. This period would later be called the Phony War. Britain and France had declared war, but the expected great land offensive against Germany had not begun. This silence was deceptive. The war was waiting for time to spread. Germany was preparing new plans in the West. The Soviet Union was expanding its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Britain and France were beginning to understand that they had entered a long and uncertain war. The invasion of Poland was different from all the earlier crises in Europe. In the Rhineland, treaties had been violated. In Austria, independence had been destroyed. Czechoslovakia had been broken apart. But in Poland, borders were no longer merely changed. War began. That is why September 1st, 1939 does not stand in history only as the day of an attack. It was the day when all the decisions delayed for years, all the warnings ignored, and all the intentions misread finally exploded. The anger created by Versailles, the wounds opened by the Great Depression, the collapse of Weimar democracy, the rise of the Nazi regime, the weakness of the League of Nations, the response in the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the concession made at Munich, the occupation of Prague, the guarantee given to Poland, the German-Soviet Pact. All of these steps came together on the morning of September 1st. A war had begun. But on that morning, no one fully knew how far that war would grow. Many still hoped that it might remain limited. Some believed a diplomatic solution could be found within a few months. Others thought Germany's quick victories would eventually lead back to the bargaining table. But World War II would not stop where it began. After Poland, the war would spread north, west, south, and east. It would cross the borders of Europe, reaching Africa, Asia, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. It would pull in millions of people, destroy cities, shake empires, and transform the world order from top to bottom. But at the threshold of all this, in September 1939, the most basic question was still the same. Was this catastrophe truly inevitable? Or could different decisions, made at different moments, have produced different results? To answer that question, we must look one final time at the entire chain behind the beginning of the war, because World War II did not begin in a single day. But when that day arrived, it could no longer be stopped. When World War II began, many people looked back and asked the same question. Could this catastrophe have been prevented? The question seems simple, but the answer is not simple. Because tying World War II to a single cause would oversimplify one of the greatest disasters in history. This war did not begin only on the morning of September 1st, 1939. It did not begin only on the Polish border. It did not begin only with the implementation of a military plan. The roots of this war had been planted years earlier. The order created at the end of the First World War wanted to secure peace. But inside that order were deep feelings of revenge, mistrust, and perceived injustice. While the Treaty of Versailles meant security for the victors, it became a symbol of humiliation for many people in Germany. That perception became one of the strongest materials used by Nazi propaganda. Instead of facing the real reasons for Germany's defeat, enemies were sought. A war lost at the front was told, as if it had been a victory betrayed from within. This myth became a heavy burden for the democratic order in its earliest years. The Weimar Republic was born under that burden. The costs of war, economic problems, political violence, street clashes, and the broken trust of the public, all of these left democracy vulnerable. Then came 1929. The economic depression did not only close factories, it also closed people's confidence in the future. Unemployment rose, savings disappeared, families were dragged into poverty. The political center weakened. Extreme movements gained strength. In times of crisis, people often do not look for complex answers. They look for answers that appear strong. Hitler's rise took place in this environment. He did not offer the public only a program. He offered a language of anger. He offered a list of those to blame. He offered a promise of rebirth. He said Germany would break its chains, bring order, provide work, and restore national pride. Behind these promises lay repression, violence, racism, preparation for war, and an expansionist ideology. After 1933, the transformation of the German state moved very quickly. Democratic institutions were hollowed out from within. Opposition was crushed. The press was controlled. Political parties were eliminated. The army was tied to the will of the leader. Society was pushed toward a single ideological goal. While dictatorship was being built at home, the ground for war was being prepared abroad. Germany left the League of Nations. It rearmed. It introduced conscription. It announced its air force. The Versailles Order was being destroyed step by step. The world saw this. But the world could not produce a united and determined response. This was not only weakness. There was fear of war. There was economic crisis. There was pressure from public opinion. There was the trauma of the First World War. In Britain and France, millions of people feared that a new war would destroy civilization again. This fear was human. But in Hitler's hands, it became an advantage. That advantage was tested in the Rhineland. When German troops entered the demilitarized zone, Europe stood for a short time at a threshold that might have changed history. If France had responded firmly, Germany might have been forced to retreat. But France did not want to act alone. Britain did not want to risk war. Hitler won. This victory gave him superiority not only on the ground, but also in the minds of his opponents. He had now measured the indecision of the states facing him. Then came Austria. With the Anschluss, an independent state was incorporated into Germany. Europe protested again, but did not stop it. Then the Czechoslovak crisis began. The rights of the German population in the Sudetenland were used as a justification. The crisis was expanded. The threat of war was increased. In Munich, leaders tried to save peace, but peace was being preserved by bargaining over the territory of a state. Czechoslovakia was not at the table. While decisions were made about its own fate, it became an object of calculation for the great powers. The Munich Agreement gave many people short-term relief, but for Hitler, it became a new source of courage, because concession did not stop aggression. The occupation of Prague clearly showed that Hitler's goals were not limited to the Sudetenland. The issue had gone beyond the claim of uniting German-speaking communities. Germany wanted to change the map of Europe through force. After this point, the attitude of Britain and France hardened. A guarantee was given to Poland. But giving a guarantee was not enough to prevent war, because Hitler still believed that the other side would retreat at the last moment. Earlier crises had created a habit in his mind. Take a risk, apply pressure, raise the threat of war, and wait for the other side to step back. This calculation continued in the Polish crisis. Danzig and the Polish corridor were the visible face of Germany's demands, but behind them lay a larger goal. Poland stood in the way of Nazi Germany's plans for expansion toward the east. The final lock was opened in August 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Ideological hostility was pushed behind calculation of interest. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland became a target to be shared between two great powers. Hitler therefore believed he had temporarily removed the threat from the East. And on the morning of September 1st, 1939, the attack began. Poland was quickly dragged into massive destruction. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd. The European war had begun. So, was this war inevitable? If we call it inevitable, we diminish the importance of human decisions. Because history is not only the automatic result of great powers, economic crises, and treaties. History is also the sum of choices. Versailles could have been built differently. Weimar democracy could have been supported more strongly. Economic crisis could have been answered more effectively. Hitler's first violations could have been opposed earlier. A different decision could have been taken in the Rhineland. Czechoslovakia might not have been left alone at Munich. A more reliable agreement between the Soviet Union and the Western powers might have been established earlier. We cannot say with certainty that any one of these would have changed the final outcome, but each was a threshold that could have altered the road to war. For this reason, the most important point in understanding World War II is this: war did not become inevitable all at once. It became possible step by step. Each crisis made the next crisis easier. Each weak response increased the next risk. Each miscalculation brought leaders a little closer to the abyss, and in the end, the world fell into war once again. The beginning of World War II does not tell us only about the past. It also shows how fragile international orders can be. It reminds us that treaties, institutions, and diplomatic promises are only as strong as the will that protects them. Peace is not merely the absence of war. Peace requires a sense of justice, economic stability, political courage, social trust, and a shared will capable of deterring aggression. The road from 1919 to 1939 showed how these elements could be worn away. First, trust disappeared. Then democracy weakened. Then treaties were violated. Then borders were changed. Then states were left alone. And finally, war began. The morning of September 1st, 1939 was the visible explosion point of this entire chain. The war that began that morning would become the most destructive conflict in human history. Millions would die, cities would be reduced to ruins, genocide and occupation policies would form some of the darkest pages in history, and the world order would be completely transformed. But the first step in understanding all this is to look at the beginning, because great catastrophes are often prepared quietly before they arrive with noise, in the lines of a treaty, in the streets of an economic crisis, in the crowd of a rally, in the hesitation of a government, in the violation of a border, in the relief that follows a concession, in the next crisis that is ignored. The story of World War II shows us that wars do not begin only at the fronts. Sometimes war approaches at the very moments when people believe they are preserving peace. And by 1939, the world realized this too late. That is why the beginning of World War II is not only a historical subject left in the past, it is a great warning about how power, fear, diplomacy, and miscalculation can come together. At the end of the First World War, people wanted to believe that the same catastrophe would never happen again. 20 years later, the world entered a far greater war. And what remained was this bitter truth. Preserving peace begins with the treaties made after war, but it does not survive by treaties alone.